Will you stand as we read from the scripture? The verse that probably most people turn to during times of stress more than any other verse in the Bible. The Lord is my shepherd, I will not be in need. He lets me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for the sake of his name. And even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Be seated. I'm honored to be here this morning to fill in for Pastor Dave. This is a troubling time, and someone kind enough earlier this morning said I should warn you. I'm a psychologist, a clinical psychologist, so some of the things I'm going to be talking about may jar you. That's what we do in psychology. So fasten your seatbelt. So let me get this straight. So Laura East, you had a celebration for her on January 5th. She got on a plane and left on January 6th, and half of LA burned down on January 7th. Did I get that right? Yeah. She was probably one of the most compassionate people I knew. Just the way she spoke. It would be so helpful to have her here, just to listen to her talk. She had a calming presence about her. Texas is lucky. And when Pastor Dave reached out to me this week and he said, look, I've got COVID, can you fill in for me? I said, your people have suffered enough. Yes, I will come. I'm not Laura. I'm very different. You'll see from my style, so many of you know me. But yes, I'm honored to be here. We are all living now with ambient trauma. It's in the air, all of you. If you didn't lose your home, which some of you did, if you didn't lose all your possessions, which some of you did, you know someone who did. So we're all in this together. You feel it. If you're not in trauma, you're trauma adjacent. So that means we're all living in this ambient feeling of trauma. Pascal once said, it is a remarkable fact that no canonical writer ever used nature to prove God. That's interesting, because many of my most spiritual experiences have been out in nature, but nature is just as cruel as it is beautiful. There's an Instagram site that I hope none of you ever go to. Let's see, it's called The Darker Side of Nature. That's it. Don't go there. So it's short videos on how cruel nature can be. Animals eating animals, nature threatening us, threatening our lives. So nature alone is not enough to argue for the existence of God. You look to nature, look around you, trauma is with us. It's with all of us. C.S. Lewis said, Christianity is not the conclusion of a philosophical debate on the origins of the universe. It is a catastrophic historical event following a long spiritual preparation of humanity for it. God came crashing into our world, our fallen world, our world with trauma, our world with a nature that is both beautiful and cruel. So for those of us who love God, how do we make sense of the trauma in our world? How do we make sense of this suffering that's all around us? On Tuesday, January 7, I was waiting for my 4 p.m. client. I'll call him Brian. Hardworking guy from the Midwest. He met a wonderful woman also from the Midwest. She decided she didn't like snow, so they moved to Santa Monica. This was where they wanted to live. They thought that's where all lucky people get to live. He worked very hard. He worked himself up to the top of his organization. They had 3 beautiful kids, and so they decided they could finally afford to move to the house of their dreams in the Highlands. They were at the top. They could see the ocean. Their kids went to the best of schools. They were living the American dream. That's what they believed. I had heard that there were some fires in the Palisades, but I'm from California. We have fires all the time. You know, they don't come to our homes. You know, they just burn around us, don't they? And then 405, 406, 408, 410, he's not here, so I decided to text him. His response is, oh my gosh, I completely forgot we had a session today. My home just burned down to the ground. He texted me a picture of his once beautiful home, and it was just flames. It was just all in flames. They lost everything. They lost their school. They lost everything they owned except the clothes on their back. Everything was gone. So for the next 2.5 weeks, we're still talking. And he made an interesting comment to me. He said, I've seen the best and the worst of humanity as a result of this tragedy. Friends took him into his home, him and his 3 kids, young kids. You want to take 3 young kids into your home? I raised 3 young kids. I don't want them again. The older ones are tough too, but the point is that people were very kind in taking him in. They didn't blink an eye. Yes, stay with us. That night he was staying with friends. The kindness really moved him of the people around him. And as he was coming down the hill, he probably stayed too late, trying to put out the fire with a garden hose or something. And so as he's coming down, a looter was coming up, passing him on the street. And the looter actually says to him, is it too late to loot? I was proud of him for exercising some restraint. He just kept walking. He found a rental property. He's one of the fortunate ones. He has insurance. He still has his job. So ironically, he feels guilty. It's like, well, there are people who've lost everything, and they're not going to come back. What about people in their 70s or 80s? They're not going to rebuild. That'll take too long. You know, I'm still young enough. I can do this, so I feel guilty. There was a clothing store that offered free clothes for anyone who was a fire victim. And he was too guilty to take clothes, but he went in and he did take 2 shirts, but then he bought 2 pairs of pants because he felt too guilty. I want to do my part. He believes he's actually one of the fortunate ones. But this catastrophic event left their lives changed forever. C.S. Lewis also says, Christianity creates rather than solves the problem of pain. Christianity creates rather than solves the problem of pain. You see, we believe in a personal, loving God that's all-powerful, and still we suffer. Other religions don't believe in a personal God. So for them, suffering is just part of life. It's just the other side of happiness, right? But we have to somehow respond to this. So we have a loving God who came crashing into our world, which is full of tragedy. Where is God in times like this? I think that we, as Christians, don't have a good answer as to why suffering exists, but we've got a great answer as to what to do when it does. We know how to respond. Okay, here comes the psychological part. I'm going to talk about PTSD for a minute. I think you need to know what this is, because if you don't have it, you know someone that does and someone that will. Bessel van der Kolk is the psychologist who developed the PTSD diagnosis. And he did that back in the Vietnam era because we had Vietnam vets coming back from war, suffering from what we then called shell shock. But it was so tragic that we lost more Vietnam vets to suicide than we did actually in the war after they came back. So they were suffering terribly from this aftermath of trauma that we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's important to at least know what it is. I'm going to go over the basic symptoms for you. You have to have been exposed to death or serious injury or a trauma like a wildfire. You re-experience the events, probably nightmares or flashbacks, or you have triggering reminders of it and intrusive memories. It just keeps popping into your head. You don't want to think about it, but you keep thinking about it. You have the desire to avoid thoughts or feelings that remind you of this trauma. So you're actively trying not to think about the things you can't stop thinking about. You try to avoid going to places or doing things that make you feel those feelings or remember those thoughts. And you become negative in your thoughts about yourself or about the world. Maybe the world isn't such a great place. Or maybe I'm not such a great person. And a loss of interest of things that you once found pleasurable. Irritability. Now, I know some of you are irritable quite naturally, so let's say more irritability than you normally have. Hypervigilance. And hypervigilance isn't just vigilance. Vigilance is looking out, right? Hypervigilance is I'm looking out so much that I actually see things that aren't there. I worked with a woman once who was traumatized by a police officer. And so every time she was driving in her car and someone turns on their blinkers, she sees a cop car. That's hypervigilance, right? I'm going to protect myself before it gets me. Exaggerated startle response. That's a good one. So someone comes into the room and you startle like that. Somebody drops a book and you say, what am I doing? Why am I jerking around like that? It's exaggerated startle response is a sign of PTSD. And sleep and concentration problems. You have trouble following the conversation, you have trouble either falling asleep or waking up early. Both of those, I do those quite naturally, so you get worse at those things. And you have either what we call depersonalization or derealization. Now, depersonalization is I don't feel real, like I'm in a dream. Derealization is you don't feel real, everybody around you. This is a dream. This can't be true. This can't be happening. This is all a dream. So technically, you cannot be diagnosed with PTSD unless you've had these symptoms for at least a month. It hasn't even been a month yet. So technically, I cannot diagnose any of you with PTSD yet. If you're feeling all these symptoms now, then you have what we call an acute distress disorder. It's not post yet, you're in it. You're still in it. So you have acute stress disorder if you have any of these symptoms. And it is natural to have these symptoms in and through and after a trauma. There's nothing wrong with you, there's something wrong with your circumstances that just went sideways. So, the good news, I can't diagnose any of you with PTSD. The bad news is some of you may already have these symptoms and they may persist. Another piece of good news is that in most cases it resolves itself. In most cases, in time, the symptoms recede and go into the background. But for some of you, you won't be that lucky. The symptoms will persist 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, longer. All these things are still happening to you. Again, there's nothing wrong with you, there's something wrong with your circumstances. And this is your reaction to your circumstances. We don't really know why some people have PTSD that persists and some people get over it. The symptoms just go away naturally. We think it's some combination of biological, psychological, environmental factors. But if you're someone who has these things that persist, you're going to probably need some assistance, some help to get through it. And interestingly enough, we know for people who are happy or return to a state of happiness, the main reason you're happy is because it's your personality type. It's not really because of money or success or good looks or even health. I have a couple of friends of mine, they're both therapists, and they're just the happiest people I know. And there's no reason for them to be that happy, they just are. It's their personality. So some of you are happy people, some of you not. It's your personality, right? I asked my friend Margaret once, or I said to her, you know, you and Charlie are just the happiest people I know. And you know what she said to me? Yeah, we are the happiest people we know too. Look around, most people are not happy. So for all of us, at the core of surviving pain, we have to make meaning of it in our midst. Your challenge, no matter what your pain is, no matter what your suffering is, and you all have it, the challenge is for you to make meaning in your life in the midst of your suffering. So if we can't say why suffering exists, for us as Christians, what is the answer to what we're supposed to do when it does? Where do we look for meaning in our suffering? Well, don't look to your circumstances. You won't find it there. Look to relationships. You'll find it there. We're created by God as fundamentally relational creatures. And you'll find meaning in your life if you look into relationships, to look for relationships to find the meaning of your life. Lewis also said, when pain is to be borne, a little courage helps more than knowledge, a little sympathy helps more than much courage, and the least little tincture of the love of God more than all. That first phrase is important. When people are in pain, they need courage more than knowledge, and they need sympathy more than courage. They need compassion more than courage. Too often we try to offer them knowledge, give you advice. Well, I was there too, or misquote scripture with platitudes when people are in the midst of their suffering. Don't do that. They don't need knowledge at that point. They need courage, and they need sympathy, and they need the love of God. So I'm going to quote to you now probably the most misused verse in the Bible when it comes to times in suffering. People quote this verse at exactly the wrong time, so don't do that. Romans 8:28. And we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God and those who are called according to his purpose. Okay, wait, my house just burned down. God causes all things to work together for good to those, wait, what? See, actually this verse is mistranslated in almost every English Bible. We have this phobia in Western theology of thinking that anything good can come from us. It has to come from God. So we're not going to say anything good can come from us. All good things have to come from God for us, right? That's actually not what the verse says in Greek. N.T. Wright, brilliant theologian, says that, no, that word to those is actually sunerge, which means with, in, and through. Okay, what? So the verse actually says, we know that God causes all things to work together for good with and in and through those who love God. Well, that changes the whole meaning. No, God is saying, I want to partner with you to do good in the world. And I'm telling you that I'm going to work through you to do good things for other people. It's not saying, I'm going to give you all good things no matter what. You think something bad? No, it's actually good. You just can't tell. That's not what it says. Now, actually, I think that does happen at times. There are plenty of times in my life when I thought something terrible was happening, turned out later it was a good thing for me. I think there was a woman I wanted to date. Good thing she's not my wife. It worked out very well. I'm with the woman I am with, Sometimes the best answer to prayer from God is no. But that's not what this verse says. It's not all things work together so that you can have good things. It's God and those who love him who work together for good. God and those who love him and feel called according to his purpose, they work together for good. People who love God are called to stand in the darkness with others and partner with God to work together for good. That's the point of this verse. Paul is inviting you to stand with God to love others during difficult times. Actually what it means. People ask me as a psychologist, what do I tell my children? They have friends who've lost their homes, they've lost everything, lost all their toys, they've lost their school, they've lost where they live, they're completely disoriented. What do I tell my children in times like this? And I say, you tell your children, look for the helpers. Look for the people who are helping. Look for the people who went to the retirement home in Altadena, the neighbors who went there and loaded these people in wheelchairs in their cars to take them to safety. Look for the fire captain who went back when a woman's husband couldn't go back to get her to save her in the midst of the fire and bring her to safety. Look for the helpers, then you'll see God. Look for the helpers. Don't just look at the tragedy. We have a God who suffers with us in our time of need. One of my very closest friends is a Presbyterian pastor in Atlanta. I was the best man in his wedding. He officiated over mine. I talked to him about every other week. He married his college sweetheart and moved to Atlanta and pastored one of the largest churches there for many, many years. He has 3 beautiful, talented children. So beautiful, so talented that they're almost as beautiful and talented as my kids. Almost. That's how beautiful and talented they are. But as Scott often says to me, God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. It's a sobering passage. There's a randomness to trauma in life. There are times when there is no answer why good things would happen and why bad things would happen. Justin was his youngest child, perhaps the one that was most like him. He was passionate. He would go on missionary trips. In his early 20s, he was a missionary to Africa. He loved everyone, had a deep personal relationship with God, and was passionate about everything that he did. As often happens with spiritual people, Justin suffered from depression, a serious depression. He took medication, he went to therapy, but it just kept getting worse. I believe there was an onset of mental illness in his mid-20s that was even worse than depression that emerged. Because after a very meaningful conversation with his father, he went home and took his own life. 25-year-old boy. That's too young. Scott was thrown into his own depression and trauma and tragedy. It's very hard on his marriage. We know that in marriages where they lose a children, there's an 80% chance you'll end up in divorce. They're still together, still married, but they struggle. Scott shared with me, I talked to him this last Friday, he shared with me, there was one thing that helped me during this time when I was struggling. One thing that helped me when I thought, where's God? One of the most Christ-like men I know. And he said, it was a phrase from the Apostles' Creed. We all know that, right? So what's the phrase? You remember, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, was buried, and he descended into hell. Our God descended into hell. You remember, on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Hell is separation from God. So in that moment, the Son of God felt separated from God. That's hell. This is not a lack of faith. It's a psychological property of trauma. If you've been traumatized, really traumatized, you feel nobody gets it. You're alone. You'll stand in a room like this, and you feel like you guys are all alien. You have no idea. You don't get it. Nobody gets it. God doesn't get it. If you feel that way, it's not a lack of faith. It's a psychological property of trauma to make you feel that nobody gets it and that you're incredibly, incredibly alone. But the Apostles' Creed goes on. On the third day, he rose again from the dead. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of God, the Father Almighty. We believe in resurrection. We believe in redemption. We have a God who has suffered like we have suffered. So when you're suffering and you feel you're alone, there's a God who gets that, your God, that you're actually not alone. There's a God who also felt that degree of trauma, the one that makes you feel that no one gets it, not even God. So the resurrection is our hope, and the belief in a God, a loving God who crashed into our world to suffer with us so we would not be alone. The fact that you're going to suffer in life is not an option. You will suffer. How you face your suffering is up to you. You get to choose. The most bitter people I know in life have suffered a great deal. And the best people I know in life have suffered a great deal. So you choose. Suffering is a force, and it's going to push you in a direction. Is it going to push you towards people and look for a relationship to see the face of God there? Or is it going to push you into isolation and loneliness and bitterness? Your suffering will do one of two things. It will make you a bitter person or a better person. You get to choose the direction. You don't get to choose whether or not you suffer. So I would say to you, what is it that we do? What do we as Christians, believers in a loving God, what do we do during times of suffering? Well, whatever you do, don't do it alone. You're ontologically created to be in relationship, first with God and then with others. And if you're going to find meaning in your suffering, you can't do it if you're alone. You need to come to churches like this. You need to reach out to people like these people. You need to not try to face your suffering alone. Be one of the helpers. You be the helper. Be the person who, when you go into suffering, you're the face of God to those people. And if you are suffering, don't do it alone. Look for the helpers. Look for the helpers. Because you're not going to see God in your circumstances. You're not going to find God anywhere but in relationship with him. And if you can't see that or feel that, just as Jesus did, then look for the helpers around you. You'll see God there. Let's take a moment for silent meditation. We'll think on these things and then sing a hymn.